May 11, 1945. 0400 hours. USS Bunker Hill, aircraft carrier CV-17, was steaming with Task Force 58 approximately 100 miles off the coast of Okinawa. The pre-dawn darkness was broken only by the running lights of the task force's ships and the occasional flash of anti-aircraft fire as nervous gunners shot at shadows. It had been a long night, as every night was off Okinawa, where Japanese kamikaze attacks had become a daily nightmare for American forces. Bunker Hill was one of the Essex-class carriers that formed the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. She displaced over 36,000 tons when fully loaded, stretched 872 feet from bow to stern, and could carry over 90 aircraft. More importantly, she had a combat record that few carriers could match. Since entering the war in May 1943, Bunker Hill had participated in operations across the Pacific. She had hit Rabaul, supported the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, fought at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, supported MacArthur's return to the Philippines, and had been at sea almost continuously for 2 years. The carrier's Air Group 84, was one of the most experienced in the fleet. They had flown hundreds of combat missions, shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft, and sunk thousands of tons of Japanese shipping. The ship's company, over 3,000 officers and men, knew their jobs intimately. They had been through typhoons, air attacks, and the constant grind of combat operations. They were confident, professional, and perhaps just a little too comfortable with how dangerous their job really was. That comfort was about to be shattered. The morning of May 11th had started normally. Bunker Hill's flight deck was crowded with aircraft being prepared for the day's first strike against Japanese positions on Okinawa. Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers were lined up wingtip to wingtip, each being fueled, armed, and pre-flighted by plane captains and ordnance men. Hundreds of sailors swarmed across the flight deck in the controlled chaos that preceded every launch. Aviation fuel hoses snaked across the deck. Bombs and rockets sat on carts waiting to be loaded. It was a routine morning on a carrier at war, dangerous work done every day by thousands of sailors across the fleet. But May 11th was not going to be a routine day. At 10:49 in the morning, everything would change in 30 seconds. 2 Japanese aircraft would transform USS Bunker Hill from a functioning warship into a burning wreck. Over 400 sailors would die in the first minutes. The fires would burn for hours. The casualties would be so high that some officers recommended abandoning ship. But Bunker Hill's crew would refuse to quit. They would fight fires that reached temperatures hot enough to melt steel. They would throw live ordnance overboard with their bare hands. They would operate from both ends of the ship after the center was cut off by fire. And they would save their ship against odds that seemed impossible. This is the story of the worst kamikaze attack to hit an American aircraft carrier that survived the war. This is the story of 30 seconds that killed over 400 men and should have sunk one of America's most powerful warships. And this is the story of the crew that refused to let Bunker Hill die, even when death seemed inevitable. The Japanese would claim they sank Bunker Hill. They were wrong. Bunker Hill made it home. But the price was paid in blood and courage that would never be forgotten by anyone who was there that terrible morning. At 10:49 on the morning of May 11th, 1945, the situation on USS Bunker Hill's flight deck was exactly what Japanese kamikaze pilots had been trained to look for. Dozens of aircraft parked close together, all fully fueled, all loaded with bombs and rockets, and hundreds of sailors swarming around them. It was a target-rich environment, and one that promised maximum destruction if hit. The combat air patrol was up, but they couldn't be everywhere. And on this particular morning, 2 Japanese aircraft had managed to slip through the fighter screen by hiding in clouds and approaching from the direction of the sun. They were about to execute one of the most devastating kamikaze attacks of the entire war. The first aircraft was a Mitsubishi Zero fighter, piloted by a Japanese Navy pilot whose name was never recorded, but whose skill and determination would leave a permanent mark on naval history. The Zero had been spotted by Bunker Hill's radar operators, but it was too late to vector fighters to intercept. The Kamikaze dove out of the sun at over 400 miles per hour, aimed directly at the crowded flight deck. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and bursts of 40mm and 20mm shells. But the Zero held its dive, weaving slightly to throw off the gunner's aim, coming straight at the carrier. At approximately 10:49 and 30 seconds, the Zero crashed into Bunker Hill's flight deck near the aft elevator. The impact was devastating. The Zero's 500-pound bomb, still attached to the aircraft, detonated on contact with the deck. The explosion tore a massive hole in the wooden flight deck and sent fragments of aircraft and bomb shrapnel spraying across the deck in all directions. Sailors working on nearby aircraft were killed instantly, cut down by shrapnel before they even knew what was happening. Fuel from ruptured aircraft tanks sprayed across the deck and ignited immediately, creating a wall of flame that swept across the aft third of the flight deck. The parked aircraft, fully fueled and armed, began exploding almost immediately. The heat from the initial fire caused fuel tanks to rupture and ignite. Bombs that had been loaded on wing racks began cooking off from the intense heat. Rockets, designed to be stable under normal conditions, but vulnerable to fire, began launching themselves in random directions. Some shot across the deck, starting new fires wherever they hit. Others launched straight up into the air or out over the side of the ship. A few rocketed into the carrier's island superstructure, starting fires in compartments that should have been safe. Before anyone could react, before damage control parties could even begin to respond, the second kamikaze struck. This aircraft was a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, also carrying a 500-pound bomb. The pilot had followed the Zero in, waiting just long enough for the first explosion to draw everyone's attention aft, then diving on the forward part of the ship. At 10:50, exactly 30 seconds after the first impact, the Judy crashed into the base of Bunker Hill's island superstructure. The pilot had aimed perfectly. The Judy's bomb penetrated through the flight deck and exploded in the gallery deck directly below, in a compartment that was crowded with personnel. The explosion killed everyone in the compartment instantly and started massive fires on multiple decks. Worse, the explosion damaged critical systems in the island superstructure. Communication lines were cut. Fire mains were ruptured. The Combat Information Center, which coordinated the ship's defenses, was damaged and filled with smoke. The carrier's ability to coordinate a response to the attack had been crippled in the first seconds. The combination of the two attacks, 30 seconds apart, was catastrophically effective. The aft third of the flight deck was a sea of flame. The forward part of the carrier was cut off from the aft by fire and smoke. The island superstructure was burning. Aircraft continued to explode as their fuel and ordnance cooked off. The casualties in the first 5 minutes exceeded anything Bunker Hill had experienced in 2 years of combat. Bodies lay across the flight deck, some killed by the initial explosions, others cut down by flying shrapnel or burned by aviation fuel fires. The wounded screamed for help, but in many cases there was no one to help them, because the corpsmen were casualties themselves. Captain George Seitz, commanding Bunker Hill, was on the bridge when both kamikazes hit. He felt the ship shudder from the impacts and saw the massive fireballs erupt from his flight deck. For a moment, he simply stared in shock at what had happened to his ship in 30 seconds. Then his training took over. He grabbed the IMC microphone and gave orders to the crew. Counterflood to correct any list. All damage control parties to their stations. All hands not immediately engaged in damage control to move to safe areas. Fight the fires. Save the ship. But even as Captain Seitz gave those orders, he knew that Bunker Hill was in desperate trouble. The fires were out of control. The casualties were overwhelming. Communications were disrupted, and the explosions were continuing as more ordnance cooked off. He had to consider the unthinkable. Should he order abandoned ship? If Bunker Hill's magazines exploded, or if the fires reached her aviation fuel storage tanks, the carrier would be lost anyway. Better to get the crew off now than to wait until it was too late. But Seitz hesitated. His crew was fighting. Damage control parties were responding. Maybe, just maybe, Bunker Hill could be saved. He decided to wait and see what his crew could accomplish. That decision would prove to be the right one, but it would take hours of desperate fighting to prove it. Within minutes of the two Kamikaze impacts, USS Bunker Hill's flight deck had become a vision of hell. The entire aft third of the deck, from the island superstructure back to the stern, was engulfed in flames. Temperatures reached over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, hot enough to melt aluminum and cause steel to glow red hot. The wooden flight deck planking was burning, creating clouds of thick black smoke that reduced visibility to near zero. And through it all, ordnance continued to explode as bombs and rockets cooked off from the intense heat. The sailors on the flight deck faced an impossible situation. Those who had survived the initial explosions found themselves surrounded by fire, cut off from escape routes, with no clear way to safety. Many were wounded, suffering from burns, shrapnel injuries, or blast trauma. The noise was overwhelming. The roar of flames, the explosion of ordnance, the screams of wounded men, the metallic groaning of the ship's structure as it was heated and twisted by fire. It was chaos beyond anything these men had been trained for or could have imagined. But even in this chaos, acts of extraordinary heroism began to emerge. Sailors who could have saved themselves instead stayed to help wounded shipmates. Plane captains who had lost their aircraft began organizing firefighting efforts with whatever equipment they could find. Officers who had been knocked down by explosions got back up and started directing survivors to safety. The crew of Bunker Hill, shocked and terrified though they were, began to fight back against the fires that were consuming their ship. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph Carmichael, a flight deck officer, found himself near the aft elevator when the first Kamikaze hit. The explosion knocked him down and peppered him with shrapnel, but he was able to get back on his feet. Looking around, he saw dozens of wounded sailors who needed help. The normal evacuation routes through the island superstructure were cut off by fire and smoke. Carmichael made a decision. He would organize an evacuation over the side of the ship. He began directing wounded sailors to the deck edge, where cargo nets had been rigged over the side. Men began climbing down the nets to the catwalk level, then making their way forward to less damaged areas of the ship. It was slow and dangerous, but it worked. Carmichael stayed at his post for over an hour, directing the evacuation until he collapsed from his wounds and had to be evacuated himself. On the hangar deck, directly below the burning flight deck, the situation was even more desperate. The two Kamikaze explosions had blown holes in the flight deck, and burning aviation fuel was raining down into the hangar bay. Aircraft that were parked in the hangar for maintenance began catching fire. Ordnance that was stored in the hangar began exploding. The hangar deck, normally a busy workspace where aircraft were serviced and repaired, became a death trap. Sailors tried to push burning aircraft toward the hangar deck elevators so they could be dumped over the side, but the elevators had been damaged and weren't working. All they could do was try to contain the fires and prevent them from spreading to undamaged parts of the ship. Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Irl Henderson was in the hangar deck when the attacks occurred. He immediately began organizing firefighting efforts, directing sailors to bring hoses and foam generators to fight the aviation fuel fires. But the fire mains had been damaged by the explosions, and water pressure was minimal. The foam generators weren't working properly. Henderson and his team were fighting massive fires with inadequate equipment. But they kept trying, moving from fire to fire, containing what they could, preventing the flames from spreading into areas where they might reach magazines or fuel storage tanks. Henderson worked for over 5 hours without rest. His clothes burned and torn, his skin blistered from heat, refusing medical attention until the fires were under control. The most dangerous job on the flight deck was handling the unexploded ordnance. Bombs that had been blown clear of destroyed aircraft lay on the deck, many of them already hot enough to be dangerous. If these bombs cooked off, they could cause secondary explosions that would destroy the ship. Sailors formed working parties to jettison this ordnance, physically picking up or rolling bombs to the deck edge and throwing them overboard. They did this while fires raged around them, while other ordnance was exploding, while the deck was so hot that it burned through the soles of their shoes. It was terrifying work, but it had to be done. Every bomb thrown overboard was one less explosion that could kill the ship. Aviation Ordnance Man Second Class Donald Gary, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, made multiple trips into the burning hangar deck to rescue trapped sailors. Gary would enter smoke-filled compartments where visibility was zero, feel his way through the darkness, locate wounded men, and drag them to safety. He made over 20 rescue trips, bringing out sailors who would have died if left behind. On several occasions, he entered compartments that were about to explode, got sailors out, and cleared the area just seconds before the explosion occurred. He was burned, overcome by smoke multiple times, and wounded by shrapnel. But he kept going back until there were no more men to rescue. By noon, roughly 90 minutes after the Kamikaze attacks, the situation aboard Bunker Hill remained critical, but had stabilized slightly. The major fires on the flight deck were being contained, though they were far from extinguished. The hangar deck fires were under control in some areas and still raging in others. The casualty count was staggering and still climbing. Over 400 men were confirmed dead or missing. Hundreds more were wounded. The ship's medical facilities were overwhelmed, with corpsmen treating burns, blast injuries, and smoke inhalation cases in every available space. Bunker Hill was listing slightly from the water that had been taken on from firefighting and from counter-flooding to maintain stability. The carrier was still operational, still able to move under her own power, but she was badly hurt. And the worst might not be over. If the fires reached the magazines or the aviation fuel storage tanks, Bunker Hill would explode and sink. The crew's fight to save their ship had only just begun. One of the most remarkable aspects of USS Bunker Hill's survival was how the crew adapted to the fact that their ship had essentially been cut in two by fire. The massive fires amidships, between the island superstructure and the aft portion of the flight deck, created a barrier that couldn't be crossed. Sailors in the forward part of the ship couldn't reach the aft sections, and vice versa. Communications between the two ends were impossible because the phone lines ran through the burning sections. For all practical purposes, Bunker Hill was two separate ships that happened to be attached to the same hull, and both ends had to fight their own battles independently. Captain Seitz, trapped on the bridge in the island superstructure, could see both ends of his ship but couldn't directly control what was happening in either section. He had to trust that his officers and chiefs in both areas would do what needed to be done without orders. That trust would prove to be well placed. The crew of Bunker Hill, cut off from Central Command, simply organized themselves locally and got to work saving their ship. It was a testament to their training, their leadership, and their determination that this decentralized response worked as well as it did. In the forward part of the ship, Lieutenant Commander Henry Kuchka took charge of damage control operations. Kuchka was a young officer who had only recently reported aboard, but he immediately grasped the severity of the situation and began organizing the sailors in his section. He set up a command post on the forward flight deck where he could coordinate firefighting efforts, direct the movement of wounded to aid stations, and organize working parties to clear wreckage and jettison damaged aircraft. Without being able to communicate with the bridge or the aft section, Kuchka made decisions based on what he could see and what his training told him needed to be done. One of Kuchka's first priorities was establishing working fire mains. The main fire suppression system had been damaged by the Kamikaze hits, but there were emergency pumps that could be activated locally. Kuchka got these pumps working and began running hoses to fight the fires that threatened to spread forward from the damaged center section. He also organized bucket brigades when hoses couldn't reach certain areas. It was primitive and exhausting work, but it kept the fires from spreading into the undamaged forward sections of the carrier. In the aft section of the ship, Lieutenant James Gary took on a similar role. Gary found himself in command of approximately 300 sailors who were cut off from the rest of the ship by fire and smoke. The aft flight deck was still burning, with fires being fed by aviation fuel from ruptured aircraft tanks. Gary organized his men into firefighting teams, using whatever equipment they could scavenge from damaged or destroyed aircraft. They fought fires from the stern forward, slowly pushing the flames back, containing them, preventing them from spreading into critical areas like the steering machinery spaces and aft magazines. The communication breakdown between the forward and aft sections created some coordination problems. At one point, both sections were fighting the same fire from opposite sides, but neither knew what the other was doing. This could have been dangerous, but in practice it worked out. The fire was being attacked from both directions, which actually helped contain it faster than if only one section had been fighting it. The sailors on both ends couldn't talk to each other, but they could see what was happening and adjust their efforts accordingly. It was improvised, chaotic, and completely unplanned, but it worked. The carrier's executive officer, Commander V.R. Murphy, found himself in the aft section when the Kamikazes hit. Unable to reach the bridge and unsure whether Captain Seitz had survived, Murphy assumed command of the aft section and began making decisions about damage control priorities. He ordered the flooding of a magazine that was in danger of exploding from heat. This was a difficult decision because flooding a magazine meant losing the ammunition stored there. But Murphy judged correctly that the immediate threat of explosion was more serious than the long-term loss of ammunition. The magazine was flooded seconds before it would have detonated, potentially breaking the ship's keel and sinking her. Throughout the afternoon, both ends of Bunker Hill continued their independent fights to save the ship slowly, agonizingly slowly. They made progress. Fires were contained and then extinguished. Hot spots were cooled with seawater. Damaged structure was shored up to prevent collapse. Wreckage was cleared and thrown overboard to reduce topside weight and improve stability. The ship's list was corrected through careful counterflooding. And gradually, the two sections of the ship were reconnected as the central fires were brought under control and passageways were cleared. By late afternoon, approximately 6 hours after the Kamikaze attacks, Captain Seitz was able to walk from the bridge to the aft section of the ship for the first time since the attacks. What he saw shocked him, even though he had been watching the damage control efforts all day. The flight deck was a twisted, burned wreck. Holes gaped in the wooden planking. The island superstructure was blackened by fire and pockmarked with shrapnel damage. Dead sailors lay where they had fallen, their bodies too charred to be identified. The smell of burned fuel, burned wood, and burned flesh was overwhelming. But Bunker Hill was still afloat. She was still making way under her own power. And her crew, exhausted beyond anything they had ever experienced, was still fighting. Seitz met with his damage control officers and got a full assessment of the ship's condition. The news was grim. Over 400 dead, with the final count still uncertain. Several hundred wounded, many critically. The flight deck was unusable and would require extensive repairs before aircraft could operate from it again. Multiple compartments were damaged or destroyed. Systems throughout the ship had been affected by the fires and explosions. But critically, the ship's engineering plant was intact. The propulsion system was undamaged. The hull structure was sound, despite all the damage. Bunker Hill could still move, and she could get herself home. She wouldn't be launching aircraft or conducting combat operations anytime soon, but she had survived. Against all odds, the carrier that should have sunk was going to make it home. In the days following the Kamikaze attack, USS Bunker Hill began the long journey home to the United States for repairs. The carrier was escorted by destroyers and cruisers that stood ready to assist if the damaged ship ran into further trouble. But Bunker Hill made the journey under her own power, maintaining a steady speed despite her damage, proving that her engineering plant had survived the fires intact. It was a testament to the ship's construction and to the damage control efforts that had saved her. The casualty figures, when finally compiled, were staggering. 392 sailors and airmen had been killed in the Kamikaze attacks and the fires that followed. Another 264 had been wounded, many seriously. Total casualties exceeded 650 men, making this the worst single-day loss for any American aircraft carrier that survived the war. The only carriers that suffered more casualties were those that were sunk: Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Hornet at Santa Cruz, and Princeton at Leyte Gulf. Bunker Hill had taken losses comparable to ships that didn't survive, and yet she was steaming home under her own power. The two Japanese pilots who had attacked Bunker Hill had accomplished something extraordinary from a military standpoint. They had crippled one of America's most effective carriers, removed her from combat operations for the rest of the war, and killed or wounded over 650 sailors and airmen. It was exactly the kind of devastating blow that the Kamikaze doctrine was designed to deliver. The Japanese would list Bunker Hill as sunk in their official records. And for all practical purposes, they were right. Bunker Hill would never return to combat. Her war was over. But she hadn't sunk. Her crew had refused to let her die. The survivors of the attack carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Burns were the most common injury, and burn treatment in 1945 was primitive compared to modern medicine. Many sailors spent months in hospitals recovering from their injuries. Some would never fully recover. The psychological trauma was even more difficult to treat. Many survivors had nightmares about the attack for decades afterward. Some couldn't stand the smell of burning fuel or smoke without being transported back to that terrible day. A few had survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many of their shipmates had died. Donald Gary, the aviation ordnance man who had made over 20 rescue trips into burning compartments, received the Medal of Honor for his actions. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But Gary would later say that he didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what needed to be done, what any sailor would have done in that situation. The real heroes, he insisted, were the men who had died fighting the fires, the sailors who had stayed at their posts even when they could have evacuated, the corpsmen who had treated the wounded despite being wounded themselves. Gary's Medal of Honor represented all of them. Captain Seitz was relieved of command after Bunker Hill reached port, not as punishment, but as standard procedure after a ship suffered such severe damage and casualties. There would be investigations into whether anything could have been done differently, whether the ship had been adequately defended, whether damage control procedures had been followed correctly. These investigations would ultimately conclude that Seitz and his crew had performed admirably under impossible circumstances. The kamikaze attacks had been too fast and too well executed to prevent. The damage had been catastrophic, and yet the ship had been saved through the courage and determination of her crew. There was nothing more that could have been asked of them. USS Bunker Hill underwent extensive repairs at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. The work took months. The flight deck had to be completely rebuilt. The island superstructure had to be repaired and refitted. Damaged compartments throughout the ship had to be gutted and reconstructed. Thousands of feet of electrical cable and piping had to be replaced. By the time the work was completed, the war was over. Bunker Hill returned to service briefly in the immediate post-war period, but was decommissioned in January 1947. She had served for less than 4 years on active duty, but in that time she had compiled a combat record that few ships could match. The carrier was placed in the reserve fleet, mothballed against a possible future need. Various plans were proposed to modernize her or convert her for other uses, but none came to fruition. The Cold War Navy was moving towards supercarriers and angled flight decks, and the Essex-class carriers, despite their excellent World War II service, were becoming obsolete. In 1973, nearly 30 years after the kamikaze attack that almost killed her, USS Bunker Hill was sold for scrap. The carrier that wouldn't die was cut apart and melted down, her steel recycled for other uses. Today, USS Bunker Hill is remembered primarily for 2 things: her impressive combat record before May 11, 1945, and the kamikaze attack that nearly destroyed her. The ship participated in operations across the Pacific, launched aircraft that sank Japanese ships and destroyed Japanese installations, and supported amphibious invasions that brought American forces closer to Japan. But it's the kamikaze attack that most people remember. The 30 seconds that killed over 390 men and should have sunk the carrier, but didn't. It's the story of a ship that refused to die and a crew that refused to give up. The lessons learned from Bunker Hill's experience influenced carrier design and damage control procedures for years afterward. The Navy studied every aspect of the attack and the subsequent damage control efforts. Flight deck firefighting procedures were revised. Communication systems were improved to ensure that the bridge could maintain contact with all parts of the ship, even during fires. Aircraft handling procedures were modified to reduce the concentration of fueled and armed aircraft on deck at any one time. These changes, paid for with the lives of Bunker Hill's sailors, made subsequent carriers safer and more survivable. The sailors who served on USS Bunker Hill held regular reunions for decades after the war. These gatherings gave survivors a chance to reconnect with shipmates, to remember those who had died, and to share experiences with people who understood what they had been through. The bond between Bunker Hill veterans was unusually strong because of the trauma they had shared. They had seen their ship nearly destroyed. They had watched friends die. They had fought fires and explosions that should have killed them all. And they had brought their ship home. That shared experience created relationships that lasted for the rest of their lives. In recent years, efforts have been made to preserve Bunker Hill's story for future generations. Historical societies have collected oral histories from survivors. Museums have acquired artifacts from the ship. Documentaries have been produced about the Kamikaze attack and the damage control efforts that saved the carrier. These efforts ensure that the story of Bunker Hill and her crew will not be forgotten, that future generations will know about the sailors who refused to let their ship die, even when death seemed inevitable. The two Japanese kamikaze pilots who attacked USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, achieved their mission objectives. They hit their target. They caused devastating casualties. They removed a major American carrier from combat operations. From a military standpoint, it was a successful kamikaze attack, one of the most effective of the entire war. But they didn't sink Bunker Hill. They didn't break the will of her crew. They didn't achieve the ultimate goal of sending an American carrier to the bottom. And in that failure lies the larger story of why Japan lost the war. American sailors, time and again throughout the Pacific War, demonstrated a determination and resilience that the Japanese couldn't match. They saved ships that should have sunk. They won battles they should have lost. And they kept fighting no matter how bad things got. USS Bunker Hill survived because her crew wouldn't let her die. That determination, repeated across hundreds of ships and thousands of battles, won the war. The carrier that refused to sink was a symbol of the nation that refused to be defeated. And that, in the end, is why Bunker Hill's story matters. It's not just about one ship or one attack or one day of combat. It's about the courage and determination that defined the American war effort in the Pacific. USS Bunker Hill wouldn't die because her sailors wouldn't let her. And that made all the difference.